Welcome to this webinar from ITS UK, where we talk today about what everyone's talking about pretty much all the time at the moment, which is the crisis with coronavirus. On our panel today, we welcome Nick Illsley, who is a former CEO of Transport Direct and for many years before that, a leading rail professional. Gav Jackman is Managing Director at Aimsun in the UK, and Steve George, leading independent consultant and owner of SGTI. So let's talk about some of the issues affecting the ITS industry, and we'll start with the obvious reduction in travel demand and therefore the reduction in supply. And as we saw in London, it didn't really necessarily go to plan because we reduced demand, but then supply went down and the trains were still packed, which didn't really help with social distancing. So we'll bring Gav Jackman from modelling firm Aimsun in first. Gav, tell me, what are your thoughts on what we could and maybe should have done to properly understand demand, supply and model it properly so that we were delivering efficiently but still safely a public transport system?
Thanks, Paul. It's a really interesting question. And modelling professionals around the world will have a different opinion, I'm pretty sure. But I guess there's a couple of things that springs to mind is, okay, travel demand changed. So, but still there was a requirement for key workers for construction, retail and office workers that had to work from the office. They still needed to get into London, if we're just talking about London, but all the city centres around the UK. So there still was quite a large demand. And importantly, the shift patterns don't change. So you still have a demand, but then you start to limit the services. It also depends on when the actual when people actually started to reduce the time when they did go in. Aimsun took a very cautious view, I suppose, but actually we're pleased that we did. We've been now at home for nearly 3 weeks. Whereas I'm still aware that some people are still kind of, have been going into their office even just a week ago. So the demand was still there, but obviously if you limit the services and you've still got people going in at the same time, you're going to get a problem. One of the things I don't think we have as focused on as an industry is actually really thinking about travel demand. So if you remember the Olympics in 2012, massive marketing campaign about reducing the time or changing the time that you'd actually go into work or to your destination using alternative forms. And that really did actually spread the peak of people using public transport. Actually, public transport was one of the only facilities that was there. In fact, it was increased. So you've kind of got something that's going up that then went down in this case, but also you've got that demand management. I think we haven't learned those lessons that we really did benefit from at that particular time.
Nick, when you were a leading light in the rail industry, to put it that way, what would you have needed to do in this situation? And frankly, are you glad you weren't facing the situation that the rail operators have been facing?
That's a very good point, Paul. In some ways, it would be nice to play a larger part in some of the solution stuff. If you've been doing transport for 40 years, it's rather odd to sit at home at a time when the industry needs skilled people to do things. Just a couple of points, maybe on what Gavin said. The Olympics 2012, we did a lot of the journey planning for the actual event. The modelling for that took about 18 months, I think, to get right, to predict what would happen at London Bridge and Canary Wharf. Also, the marketing campaign, Get People to Change, ran for about 6 months. Yeah. This is not the same. This was almost an overnight thing where suddenly people wanted to adjust patterns and change things. And I think it highlighted two weaknesses in the overall system. The first one is actually we're still really poor at knowing who's travelling where and for what purpose. So when you said, for instance, these are key workers, we don't map travel to things like hospitals and people turning up for key things. We also, I think, were blindsided by the fact that construction workers turned out not to be people who stayed at home. And I don't think it was obvious when it happened beforehand. I don't think people knew that. But the whole linkage, I think, between travel and why people travel has been shown, I think, to be inherently weak in this process over the last couple of weeks.
And Steve, you obviously work a lot with local authorities. When it comes to roads, has there been any difficulty for local authorities, or actually is it just lower demand makes things easier?
I think actually it's the point you just made there is, I think it is lower demand makes the whole management of the road network a lot easier. I think over the last 2 weeks now, since we've been in this current situation, we've seen traffic levels fall literally day by day. So now we're looking at something like 50, 60% less demand on the road network as a result of the measures that have been implemented so far. So it really has sort of shown the impact of people working differently, people working from home or from different bases, and how that can very, very quickly affect the road network and the management of it. So I think it's going through this whole process that there are going to be a lot of lessons learned that will come out of this that we can then look at for the future, and whether we can lock in some of this sort of demand reduction when things get better, when we get the other side of the current restrictions. Do we just pop back to normal, or do we have the opportunity to think about things differently, and how people, as Nick said, how they travel to work and how they actually undertake their tasks on a day-to-day basis. But I think there's also another good point, is that not everybody can work from home. So we still have to cater for people who do have to go to a place of work, be it a factory, be it construction sites or whatever, but we still have to look at that demand and how we manage that more effectively too.
Now, if you look last week, the DFT put out the request for local authorities to share transport information with them so they could fully understand demand movements and add that into the overall model of how maybe social distancing is working or not working in the country, and therefore work out what needs to be done when, while still reducing and removing as many restrictions as possible as soon as possible to have a minimal effect on the economy. One thing that struck me that was really interesting was the fact that we had to put this urgent call out for local authorities to be sharing their data with national governments. Many might wonder why that hasn't been done before, but is it something that actually we need to start thinking about, not how we deal with data on a day-to-day basis, but actually start to get data ready just in case another event like this happens? I mean, I'll come back to you in a second, Steve, but I'll first of all just ask Nick what his view is on that.
So this is a hobby horse of mine, Paul. One of the things you might not remember that I did at DFT, I actually wrote the open data strategy in 2012, published just before the Olympics. And in that, following the Cabinet Office and Francis Maud's insistence that all public data should be open and shared, we encouraged all transport people, be they local authorities, operators, national governments, everybody, to publish their data, almost regardless of whether it was incredibly good, average or bad, but describe it in the metadata. And initially, there was a greater uptake. So initially, lots and lots of data got published. For a totally different reason, I was on data.gov.uk a few weeks ago. Most of the data sets have not been updated for 3 years that are on there. It hasn't grown. And recently doing a piece of work around Junction 34, the M1, you cannot find out who owns the data, where it is and what format it is. This is 8 years after, and we're suddenly saying, because it's a crisis, we should have this available. And frankly, the effort to publish a data set is very, very, very small. A bit of effort to write some metadata. Totally agree, Paul. Let's ask for it, let's do it. We should not in this day and age be actually having to ask for it. It should be published, and it should be there for anybody who needs to use it with appropriate metadata, and very importantly, a contact of the person who knows about it, full stop.
Well, Steve, you and I have been friends for about 20 years now, although we probably neither of us want to admit we've aged that much. But
feels like yesterday, Paul.
Of course it does. When we started working together, it was when you were doing a project in the West Midlands called Matisse that was all about sharing transport data. Does it depress you that 20 years later it takes a crisis like this to actually get people actively doing it?
I think worryingly, yes, it is a little bit depressing, because I think, like Nick has just iterated to, we have been in the process of understanding how to gather data, how to process it, and how to use it for a very long time. We just don't seem to be able to do it. The Matisse project, which goes back to 1999, was probably ahead of its time, to be fair, in the ambitions that we had to correlate multiple forms of transport data into a cohesive website that could then be delivered on to the end user as such. I think the big difference between what we were trying to achieve then and what we can achieve now is the fact that it's much easier now to gather and store and transmit data than it was back then. So the methods of communication, the ability to get to people, we've got social media now and everything, there are many more channels that we can exploit, which we didn't have back then. And I'll also go back to another project I was involved with, which was the Travel Information Highway, which was sponsored by Highways England then, Highways Agency, now Highways England, which actually endeavoured to set out the principles of data exchange that local authorities could actually adopt and use and step into this environment where we could exchange data on a common basis, basically, and in an agreed format. So a lot of what we want to do with data and information has been around for quite some time. I think it's unfortunate it takes something of this nature to actually expose the fact that we need to actually carry on doing that and to actually make these things work and use this data effectively to get the intelligence we need off the network. And I think that's what the last couple of weeks have shown, is that DFT have woken up to the fact that we do need to coordinate this information. It does tell us a lot about what's happening on the network, where people are coming from, where they're going to, when, how they travel. So we can use to good effect in terms of network management, but also other forms of public transport, so that we can encourage modal shift and that we can get people to think about how they make their journeys and why they're making their journeys.
And I think, to everyone's credit, actually, the DFT put the request out on Thursday, and by Friday afternoon had enough data for the project it was working on. So everybody did very quickly share the information, and local authorities stepped up very quickly to help out as much as they could. So in adversity, we've got further. And Gav, I guess as a modeling company, the more data you have and quality data, the better your models will be. So is this actually going to make a big difference to the ability for us to actually plan the movement of people and goods in a far better way in the future?
You'd certainly hope so, wouldn't you? I mean, I think there's, yes, if we continue along that same journey. I'm very much aware Germany have got a national clearing database or clearing warehouse for travel data, so signal data and journey time data, and it all goes to one place. It's uploaded, it's a push method, and then you can pull it down there for your point of use. So you can then select areas or select much wider scope. I've really been pushing for that for a few years through TTF and for other means, but I certainly still think that's the case. But I think it requires it needs DFT to be behind that, or even Highways England on behalf of DFT. They've got WebDress, which is a great store of information and is universal, and it's one data set, one data feed. So you write an adapter for one purpose, and you get all the information, depends on whichever area you're going to. I think there's always a temporal time to this, so I'd like to think that will continue and will grow, and they'll get some momentum behind that. Although the reality is, right now, to actually use that data from a modelling perspective, you're just going to show that there's very little volume on the network, and so do you actually need to model that? Let's not spend money for the sake of money. Don't want to advocate that in any way, shape, or form. We've been seeing 65% reduction in journeys going into Oxford on the Botley Road, which is a massive congested part of the network in Oxfordshire. But also it's one of the only areas in Oxfordshire that has got a pollutant issue. It exceeds the thresholds annually every year. And I know that's another point, and we'll come back to that another time. But actually, do we need to model traffic when there's nothing on the roads? I saw some pictures of the M3, nothing, absolutely nothing, no travel whatsoever. Amazing.
I'm hoping that once we've started the sharing of information, it's not just switched off at the end of the crisis, and actually is that step forward that everyone's talking about. And so fingers crossed that this isn't a short-term solution, but actually much more data sharing will go on. Let's actually move on just to some of the, for want of a better word, good things that ITS can help with. Because, of course, we've got Nick and Steve here who both pioneered in their own ways traveller information to the end user. A lot of what we're now desperately trying to do, which is inform people in an efficient and timely way, is stuff that the highways and transport industry have been doing for a long time. Nick, is there any way that the government and maybe the health service and other parts of industry could learn from some of the lessons that you learnt in developing and promoting Transport Direct?
So the first thing I'd say, Paul, is the biggest challenge and the biggest success of Transport Direct wasn't the IT, wasn't the data, it was the stakeholder engagement and input. So every single national government, because there were 3, local authority, transport operator, and an awful lot of other IT companies all bought into the project. There was no legal backing, there was no requirement to do it. So data sources got up to several thousand, each of which was generally kept current by the data provider. And so the number one lesson I think I would learn is that forget the data, forget the IT to start off with, concentrated on stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management. If you get that right and people buy in, the data and the commitment will flow. And in that, if probably Gavin probably remembers a guy called Sir Malcolm Field, who'd been the chief executive at W.H. Smith and chair of the CIA. Malcolm was a genius at getting people like Richard Branson to buy into the concept, and therefore the whole organisation bought in because he sold to them it was worth doing because better informed people make better decisions and lives improve. Somehow along the way, we've sort of gone back to the inputs rather than the outputs and say what we need here. And Gav, I'm not saying we don't need a data warehouse, but actually the data warehouse, you often see data warehouses and data structures that have no data in because actually the stakeholders haven't bought into the warehouse. So I think if you start with stakeholders and you start with the outputs and work back to what inputs you need to make it work, that's how you get to the right answer. And I've got to say, certainly in TTF, I had the feeling that people were going back almost to the inputs and the technology. Frankly, technologists can solve any problem you want, providing you pose them the right problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I talk about a warehouse, I think I mean you almost need people to get behind something, which actually was what you would just say was, Transport Direct. People got behind Transport Direct, but it was much more about the people buying. So I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that. We don't need a national warehouse. We just need everybody to commit to providing the data.
And Steve, I haven't been out. I haven't been beyond probably a mile of my little village that I live in since the crisis began, and so I haven't seen whether or not VMS is being used with the stay home, protect the NHS, save lives message. But I would presume that a lot of the ways that we have touch points with travellers, whether they're motorists or using public transport, can be used to push out that message.
Yeah, I mean, like you, Paul, I've been pretty much grounded the last couple of weeks, so haven't really been travelling around much. But I think you would like to think that we would use all the tools at our disposal during this particular crisis so that we can, as Nick said, we can inform people and give them accurate, timely and reliable information, basically. Because I think at the end of the day, that's how we're going to influence people, how they travel and how they almost sort of conform to the restrictions that we're asking them to abide by at the moment. So I think going back to what Nick and Gav just said, I think a lot of this is about how we use the data for the right outcome, rather than just the data itself. There's plenty of data out there we can harvest and bring in. It's really how we process that and give an outcome that is usable by the end user. And I think the whole point about the public and private sector stakeholders getting together and working together for their mutual benefit, not just now when we're in adversity, but when we're beyond this, how we can actually foster any links that are made now and make them work more effectively for us in the future. I think a lot can be done around freight and delivery vehicles, but also working with the emergency services as well, and how they route vehicles around our networks and how we can potentially assist them in what they do. We can't always do that, but we can look at the possibilities of doing that in the future.
Now, of course, there's no correlation doesn't mean causation, but there is a correlation, it appears, between air quality and the severity of the outbreaks. Some of the worst affected places in the world are those with the worst air quality. And so this could, in effect, hasten the introduction, say, of mobility as a service or other ITS-related solutions for transport, which reduce the reliance on the private car and introduce a lot more shared mobility. But there's a huge caveat with that, which is, of course, at the moment we're talking social distancing, and the best way for people to social distance is to cocoon themselves in their own car and not share on trains, buses, tubes, trams, etc.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we've kind of forced this situation into preventing people from using their private vehicles. But as you say, it is a perfect place to travel because you are isolated at this current time. I think the fact that we just force people to work from home or just to stay away from work has shown the impact, though, that reducing private car use can actually have on our environment. Because at the moment, probably freight levels are still pretty much the same with light vehicles as well. So I think it's really a question of how we look to measure the impact this has had on air quality and the benefits that delivers to cities and regions, but then think, well, how can we sustain that, or how can we make a continued impact on air quality by less private car use in the future?
Gav, would you like to pick up on that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, the study we're doing in Oxfordshire for Highways England is a really interesting one, because the air quality sensors that we've got on the network have just dropped, and you know, the traffic counters have just dropped, almost to the point where they're kind of, you know, our systems are showing errors in the data feeds because we've kind of just gone so far below normal traffic patterns. Yes, you'd like to think that going forward, you know, sustainable transport will actually have an uptake. You know, people are buying cycles, as we understand, from the likes of Halfords and those shops that are still permitted to be open. Let's hope that people continue that investment and carry on using them. Likewise, you know, if we can encourage, you know, another 10 or 15% of people to work from home 1 day a week, that will have a massive benefit across the network. It will reduce those bottlenecks, and those are, you know, most of the time on the network it's okay. It's when you get to those bottlenecks where there's just, you know, they can't, the road network can't deal with the congestion. Those are the issues, and those are the ones we remember. So if we can reduce that down just enough, that'd be amazing.
And of course, we often see modelling suggesting that transport demand is just going to go up and up and up and up and up. Well, maybe we've seen now a different way. So maybe a lot of the models, Gav, need to be ripped up and started again with very different assumptions on demand.
I think the honest answer there, probably the most professional one I can give, I think, is time will tell. Maybe we don't always need that, you know, AM and PM peak model. Maybe we don't always need the 20, 30 year model. You know, those are the ones that we all know of in modelling terms and everybody recognises. Maybe we need the, you know, adverse scenario model as well. You know, maybe we'll add that to the list of situations that we model. But certainly, the models just don't exist of what we're witnessing right now.
And Nick, of course, we're used to, for 100 years or more, the rail season ticket where you get to travel whenever you want, which means that you travel at peak time 5 days a week. Is it time for the rail industry to consider alternative season ticket options that do allow for people to work from home 1 or 2 days a week, and then maybe, as Gav says, reduce the overall demand and strain on the network?
I think, Paul, a couple of things come to mind. One is that I think the two certainties at the end of this period are that, one, people are going to be very, very tired, in some ways actually quite run down, and secondly, one suspects money's going to be in fairly short supply in the bigger picture. I don't know what that says about the recent budget. My guess is that we're not heading for a time of milk and honey and plenty going forward, meaning that we need to actually make more of what we've already got. And I think that plays into the hands of ITS and modelling and looking at supply and demand systems. I think there's a danger, though, that we all see this crisis as an opportunity to get what we've always wanted to be true and make it true. So if you want people to travel less by car, this is a reason they'll travel less by car. I think the argument they'll travel more by car, as you set out earlier, Paul, is probably almost as strong as they'll travel less by car. Likewise, working from home, well, yes, this is a good way into working from home, but it might just make people so fed up of working from home, actually going to the office seems more attractive. So I think it was Gav who said it, time will tell. What I think is important for professionals, though, is that they start to set out much better argued scenarios of why things are good and bad. And let's go back to the point about air quality. We've made almost no progress in air quality over about 20 years. Since we set out the air quality management areas, almost none of them have been withdrawn. So we've got nowhere in 20 years because we've tended to fudge around the major issues and say it's about measurement and say it's about decarbonising transport but we haven't taken any strong actions to say, this is killing lots and lots of people, why don't we do something about it? Now, looking at junction 34 of the M1, they had to close a primary school next to the junction because the air quality levels were so toxic, it wasn't a safe place for children. Now, what sort of call to action do you really need if that's not a call to action? So I think going forward, instead of us perhaps all saying what we'd like to be true and people shouldn't and whatever, it's to set out much more coherent and structured arguments about why and how to, and therefore the consequences of, and link it very much back to lifestyles and quality of life and enjoying life and whatever in the way we have done. Just one final anecdote, if I may. I joined the railway in 1976. On my induction course, I was told that we wouldn't need to worry about peak demand for long because everybody would work from home. That was in 1976. Despite all the working from home and flexible patterns, etc., there's still a morning and evening peak. And yes, Paul, of course, the railway should have years ago come up with much more flexible season tickets, especially in the era of stored demand on cards and stored demand in wallets. The fact they haven't done is a disgrace, but it's a disgrace of lots and lots of people, including the way the railways are funded and the way the systems are set up, as well as the fact that nobody's bitten the bullet and said, wait a minute, you travel 4 days a week, you're a regular valued customer, therefore will come up with a tailored solution for you. Yes, of course they should.
Nick Illsley, thank you very much. And I think to wrap up our thoughts on this webinar, the thought that, as Nick says, once all this is over, and let's hope it's sooner rather than later, money will definitely be in short supply. It's pretty certain we'll be in significant recession territory. And so, as Nick says, it's up to us, the ITS industry, to find ways of delivering efficient mobility in the most cost-effective way possible. Nick Illsley, Gav Jackman and Steve George, thank you very much. We'll meet again soon to continue this discussion. But for now, thank you for watching this webinar from ITS UK.